Greetings to you on this beautiful November 17th, 2017. It's a nice Friday here in the Phoenix area. It's around 62 degrees at 8:30 in the morning, and it's very much appreciated after such a hot summer. Today, I want to share some thoughts with you on the concept of the biblical last days. Time. What a term is time. Think about that word. Without anything mentally tangible to comprise time, there's nothing more abstract to the mind than time. In fact, if you try to find a definition for just time in its most generic sense, you're hard-pressed to find anything more defined than a non-spatial, inevitable, linear continuum. If you have any idea what that means, it's just pretty much undefinable for humans. See, time is essentially nothing to us apart from events and or experiences. Our clocks and our watches keep track of seconds, minutes, and hours, but they have no meaning outside of nouns and verbs, that in or by which we have our very existence. For humans, time is history, whatever context of history we're contemplating. So in the context of this study, time is all about and based upon biblical history and how it unfolded. The words time and times are found 203 instances in just the New Testament portion of the New King James Version of the Bible alone. And many of those are found in phrases such as second time, third time, convenient time, times past, and so on. Phrases that are translations of one of several single Greek words. However, there are only two chief Greek words for time, chronos and kairos. Kairos referring to a short period of time, even as thesaurus.com indicates, and chronos referring to a long period of time, usually comprised of multiple short periods of time defined by one or more events in some sort of chronological series. Now, while kairos is normally the one that's employed to refer to a set or right times for an event or events, chronos may also be used to represent that concept of an appropriate time, just on a larger scale. By the way, this brings to mind the word dispensation, which carries with it in the Bible, such as in Ephesians 1 verse 10, a specifically appointed time for an additional pillar administration by God within the fulfilling of His overall redemptive scheme. Just check out Galatians 4 verses 2 and 4. You'll see that throughout the larger chronos time of God bringing things together, of fulfilling His plans for man's remedy for fellowship with God, there were various smaller points in time where He would set up an administration that would last for a certain amount of time, and then it would fade away as it fulfilled its particular purpose for that part of the plan of God in general. So you'd have a lengthy period of time, a chronos period of time, divided up and supported by smaller kairos periods of time. You can go to my website and download the PDF for this discussion that I'm sharing with you right now, and on it you'll see a couple of charts. Hopefully you have that in front of you now. Maybe you found this through my website, so you download the PDF and you're following along. But if you haven't, go to a site for thelord.com and look for this particular discussion under End Times Topics and download this PDF about the last days of biblical time, biblical eschatology, and so on. And you'll find these two charts. And in the first chart, that's what I've come to now at this point. Chronos time in general was comprised of several phases, both respectively speaking long ones that I'll call chronos intervals and short ones that I'll call kairos intervals. So I'm hoping you are looking at that chart, or that timeline rather, right now to kind of get a picture in your head of what I'm talking about. So from a biblical, eschatological, soteriological perspective, that's what we're going to be looking at today. A lengthy chronos period of time divided up into either smaller chronos intervals or kairos intervals that are even smaller than a chronos. If you're looking at the chart, it'll help you to see what I'm saying. It's very difficult with some of these discussions to picture in someone's head something without there actually being a picture to look at. Anyway, so do that when you get some time if you haven't done so already. So now, biblically speaking, I'm going to keep emphasizing that we're talking about time in relation to the events of biblical prophecy and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the fulfillment of the plan of God in relation to remedying the problem of our not having fellowship with God. Okay? So biblically speaking, some periods, whether they be chronos periods or kairos periods, meaning whether they're long or short, included or even were called in the New King James Version by such phrases as the following. And I'm going to just go through these quickly, and if you get the PDF, you can look through it more detailed. You'll find phrases like this: the last hour, the last day, the last days, the last times, these last times, these last days, the last time, the time of the end of the days, the end of the age, the end of this age, the end of the ages, this generation, the present age, the present time, this age, that age, the age to come, and the ages to come. Those are all the ones that specifically we're talking about today. Obviously, we're not going to have time to look at all of those. This is going to be a one-time, one-lesson, generic discussion about what makes up the eschatological, that is, the end times. Eschatology means the end times, or soteriological, which means salvation. With salvation time, what it was all included in the time of God fulfilling His plan of redemption. So we're not talking about anything outside of the Bible. We're not talking about anything secular. We're not talking about anything unbiblical or anti-biblical, extra-biblical, I should say, I suppose. But it's about what the Bible is about concerning the last days of God's fulfilling of His scheme of redemption, as it is sometimes called. Okay, since general biblical time, chronos, was divided into intervals called hours, days, times, and ages, then we might picture time from Genesis to Revelation, something like in that second chart that I'm hoping that you're looking at. In the second chart, there's one lengthy timeline, the generic biblical chronos timeline. And within that long chronos, there are two smaller chronos times, Old Covenant chronos and New Covenant chronos. But each of those two chronos times have smaller ones that support each one of them. For example, now I'm not saying this is exactly the way the Bible is laid out. This is just an illustration, okay? So to illustrate what I'm saying, Old Covenant chronos, you might say, is divided up into three kairos times. Kairos of Adam to Noah, kairos of Noah to Moses, the kairos time of Moses to Christ. We could look at each one of those perhaps as an administration of some sort. Just something about those times that's significant and takes the plan of God from one stage to another stage to another stage. Under New Covenant chronos time, we might divide it up into three periods as well. Three kairos times. Kairos of Christ to Acts chapter 2 on Pentecost. Or kairos of Pentecost on Acts 2 up to AD 70. When Jerusalem was destroyed and the Old Covenant was completely fulfilled, according to Luke 21:22. Or the last one we might put in there is the Kairos time of AD 70, time of Jerusalem's destruction, to today. Because the New Covenant is an eternal covenant in contrast to the Old Covenant. So there's the idea. What I'm trying to picture in your heads as we go on now to mainly just discuss these things without any more charts, okay? So hopefully these charts or these timelines help to give you something mentally concrete to grab onto. And I hope that's what they do, because henceforth I'll be depending upon this to discuss several biblical chronos and kairos type statements in relation to God's timing as He accomplished His redemptive purposes, beginning with the first Adam and ending with the second Adam. Okay, so there we go. There's the beginning and the ending right there. The first Adam, the second Adam. Redemption began with the first Adam, ended with the second Adam. So you could look at the time between the two Adams as one humongous chronos time. And that humongous chronos time divided up into maybe 2 or 3 main periods. Some people like to talk about the patriarchal age of Adam to Moses and the Old Covenant age from Moses to Christ and so on. And then from Christ to now, the New Covenant age. So however you want to look at it, okay? We're not getting detailed about all of that stuff because we can divide the Bible up into various ages based on our own thinking and come up with all sorts of ages. That isn't the point here. That's not even an issue for me at this point. So I've opened up with a paragraph at the beginning of this discussion about time and how that in its most generic sense it cannot be defined, which is why when you look it up in a dictionary, definitions are based around something mentally tangible, as I try to give to you in those timelines. Namely, things like nouns and verbs found in history. That gives us something to grab onto. And because of that, as I implied earlier, the abstractness of time is comprised of events and experiences that are generally labeled by various dual-syllable E-words, such as eras, epochs, and eons. You've heard all 3 of those words. So, you got these 3 E-words, 2 syllables, eras, epochs, eons, and, these Greek words that are found in a lot of places. But the word the New King James Version and most other translations chose to employ is a single syllable A word, age. That's the word that we're familiar with the most, an age. So it's very important that we define it for this study of Bible time. What exactly is an age? Or what is it that characterizes an age? Well, per the definition of age, lexicographers seem to have little problem conceding that an age refers to the interval between the beginning and the ending of something distinctive that a person or a group of people elect as a distinguishing criteria. For example, a set of events, such as the industrial age, or a political office, such as the age of the Caesars, or even a leap in human knowledge, such as the age of enlightenment. See, we've come up with all of those. All these different times, we'll go back and look at history and say, well, from this point to this point, this really cool thing happened, and we'll just name that some particular age. And that's what the definition of age has to do with. It's from some beginning to some ending based on whatever criteria you have chosen. Okay? So you can do that on your own with practically anything. So let me give you an example here. For my wife and myself, between 1997 and 2013, for us, that was the age of homeschooling. Was it the age of other things? Of course. I could go back and look at that period of time and pick out other things that might have been significant. But we can definitely go back and look at those years and say that was the age of homeschooling for us. So anybody can do that. Biblically speaking, we could refer to the age of the judges, the age of the kings, and the age of miracles if we wish to do so. See, the Bible doesn't give those titles. You can't find those descriptive phrases in the Bible anywhere, but there's nothing wrong with doing that, going back and looking at specific times like we did in the timeline and say, well, here's this and here's that, and it kind of helps to give us something tangible in our brains to consider. The scriptures do actually employ the plural term ages. So it does use that. There are ages in biblical time stated by the Bible itself. Ages that refer to sets of events in the biblical narrative. In fact, Paul specifically even stated this. Speaking of a long-awaited revelation of the mystery behind how Yahweh would create a relationship with us, he wrote in 1 Corinthians 2:7 that God devised his plan before the ages, quote unquote. Now don't allow that statement there to just go in one ear and out the other without slowing down at least a little bit. Okay? Think about that. He said God had the conception of this plan before the ages. This plan was devised before the ages. What ages? Not just regular old generic secular or historical ages of the various peoples of all over the globe since forever in the past, but the contextual biblical narrative ages. Before the ages we read about in the Bible, God had come up with this idea, this conception that he would eventually consummate. Okay? There we go. We got to narrow it down. We're talking about that, not something else. And that's where a lot of people, scholars and commentators and so on, fail, and teachers and preachers, because they think of the ages more generically, even extra biblical. They need to narrow it down to the biblical narrative of God's redemptive plan. Those are the ages that the Bible is talking about. Okay? So I just really want to get that focused before I get to the meat of what I need to share with you in relation to last days, when the last days were. Okay, so we're talking about those ages, those biblical redemptive ages were the ones that God formed in the process of bringing that plan to fruition. You know, before the age of homeschooling, my wife and I did exist. There was time before that. There was time before various ages that we can name in our lives. But we're focused on the ages that were under consideration at any given point in discussing our lives, not something before that. So there was time before God coming up with the idea of fulfilling this plan, or he came up with this concept of this plan. Okay? Before the ages of the Bible, God had come up with this plan. Some time, get it? Time before that. Okay, now here. In Hebrews chapter 1 verse 2, we find this concept that I just mentioned of God forming these ages that are related to redemption. Hebrews 1 verse 2. In the context of Yahweh's execution of his strategy, Paul wrote, and I believe Paul wrote Hebrews, that God created the ages. Check it out. Hebrews 1 verse 2. While talking about redemption, Paul said God created the ages that were necessary to fulfill that plan, to consummate that conception he had. In fact, later on, toward the end of Hebrews chapter 11 verse 3, he said that the ages were framed by God's word. God is the one who created and framed these ages. The ages that have to do with fulfilling his redemptive plan. Those verses have nothing to do with stuff outside the redemptive plan. The biblical narrative have nothing to do with time related to just general things like how long the universe existed and how old the planets are and all that stuff. Has nothing to do with any of that. If you keep it in the context of the entire Hebrew letter, as well as in the immediate contexts of which they're used. It's sort of like how by my wife's and my decision, that is by our word, as opposed to God's word, by our word, to homeschool our kids, we created our age of homeschooling. Likewise, while implementing his plan, which of course was far greater than our homeschooling 3 kids, God required various phases or ages, whether they were Chronos ages or Kairos ages. I don't think you can have a Chronos age, biblically speaking, without Kairos ages. I think a certain set of Kairos ages make up or comprise a Chronos age. And so those had to be created to implement and accomplish his ultimate task. So what might have those ages that God had to create and frame? What might those ages have been? Well, the Bible has no names for those ages like the ones I just mentioned a moment ago. You know, the age of the industrial age, or age of enlightenment, or the age of the judges, or the age of the kings, etc. We don't find those. However, as I actually already cited, there are other less descriptive expressions such as this age, quote unquote, and the present age, quote unquote, as well as that age, quote unquote, and the age to come, quote unquote. So, at the very least, we can know that the Hebrew people including Jesus himself, who employed such expressions, had the view that there were at least two ages. Which leads us on into the main point of this study about the Bible's last days. That is, the biblical end times as opposed to Christendom's traditional perspective of it. So, there are at least 80 passages with time markers related to biblical eschatology, the study of end times or last days. To keep this study down to one lesson, I must deal only with the most relevant terms, phrases, and passages. I can't deal with all 80. Because they're found within the context of the completion of God's plan of salvation, as it's often called, the two logical terms to start with in my mind are beginning and ending. The obvious 2 points between that which was executed. In Revelation 21 verse 6, after John recorded seeing the result of God's entire plan come to fruition, with all things having been made new, with the arrival of the new heaven and earth, as well as the new Jerusalem in which God is finally able to dwell in peace with humans, he quoted the enthroned Lord saying, "It's done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the ending." It's done. I'm the beginning and the ending. In other words, it was deity who both initiated and finalized the means by which man and his Creator may dwell together in harmony. The original word for beginning is arche, A-R-C-H-E, which refers to the origin, the source, or the starting point of something, while the original word for ending in Revelation 21:6 is telos, T-E-L-O-S, which refers not to the mere end of something like a piece of a rope, but to the realization of a goal. Very important that we get that. Telos refers to the realization of a goal, whereas Greek words like akron and even eschatos don't necessarily carry the idea of a goal to be reached. Telos and its related word syntelia do carry that concept. In fact, the verb teleo means to fulfill, as in the fulfilling of prophecies. So at the beginning of Revelation chapter 1 verse 8, and at the ending of it, chapter 22 verse 13, we find deity behind the conception and the consummation of the method resulting in God's ability to have a relationship with his human creation. So it's all about time in relation to the execution of his plan, not time in relation to the creation of the physical universe. For it to have the beginning, that is the arche, pointing to the creation of the material universe, while having the ending, the telos, pointing to the creation of God's relationship with us, is an incongruity, meaning that they aren't parallel with one logically following the other. So we're not talking about last days of time in general. It's the last days related to the ages that were required within the execution of God's redemptive plan. The arche and the telos of Revelation 21:6 harken back to verse 1, being founded in and thus equivalent to the first heaven and earth, which would be the arche, which realized its fulfillment and therefore culminated in the new heaven and earth, therefore the telos. So the old heaven and earth, the first heaven and earth, incidentally the word first there is protos, as in prototype, prototype heaven and earth, which realized its fulfillment and culminated in the new heaven and earth, the telos. It reminds me of the Greek words for new. You have the word neos, which refers to the beginning of something, the beginning of it, like the first heaven and earth. Kairos, or kainos rather, I get it mixed up. Kairos has to do with time. Kainos has to do with something that's new. Kainos is the word used in new heaven and earth, the new heaven and new earth. Same thing with a new covenant. It's not neos, as in something brand new and that has just come into existence. It's kainos, which has to do with something that's become perfected. The end, that which is what we want, the mature thing. So the first heaven and earth are like the neos. The second heaven and earth are like the kainos. First heaven and earth are the type, prototype. New heaven and earth are the fulfillment. So Revelation 21:6, when he says, I'm the beginning and the ending, we can see how that fits with verse 1. The old first heaven and earth, beginning heaven and earth, has given way to the new heaven and earth. So, beginning and ending. Neos, kainos, so to speak. Also, it's the timing of all of that, the beginning and the ending, between those 2 points in time, between the first heaven and earth and the second heaven and earth, just like the first Adam and second Adam. That's the timing of which we're talking about. Now, we already discussed that God's plan was conceived before the ages, 1 Corinthians 2:7. And now we have Revelation 21:6 indicating that it began to take functional form with the initial heavens and earth, which introduced Adam, the first father of Old Covenant Israel, Isaiah 43 verse 27. Genesis 2:4a, first part of the verse says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. After which, Adam, the one who kicked off these generations, was brought into focus in chapter 2. We then recall, of course, that he was pictured as breaching God's covenant, Hosea 6 verse 7, whereupon Genesis 3:15 provides what's considered the very first prophecy concerning how God would accomplish his plan to create a harmonious relationship between his human creation and himself. Beautiful picture. First heaven and earth is found right there in connection with Adam. In other words, Genesis 2 pictures for us the beginning of the very first age in the phrase, before the ages. Was there time before that? Yes, I believe there was. I'm convinced there was time before that. But we're not talking about time before that. In fact, there had to be some time before that. Even if you're a person who holds to 24-hour periods of creation, Genesis chapter 1, the literal material planet, you still have at least, 5-6 days before Adam comes on the scene? So there was time before that. But Adam is the beginning of the plan, not the creation of a planet. Adam's the beginning of the plan. For the verse even specifically states these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. If that doesn't refer back to Revelation 21 and verse 1, I don't know what does. So, again, Genesis 2 pictures for us the beginning of the very first age in the phrase, before the ages. With the original Adam of the first heavens and earth, God created or initiated the execution of his plan, which, over a period of thousands of years with multiple ages, would finally come to fruition in and with the second and last Adam, and his establishment of the second and new heavens and earth, in which, as Peter stated, righteousness would reside. 2 Peter 3, verse 13. Jesus is, of course, the last and second Adam. 1 Corinthians 15, 45, and 47, and you might even check Romans 5, verse 14 along with that. So, following those many generations between first Adam and second Adam, you can find that in Luke 3, 23 through 38, where, it gives Jesus' genealogy all the way back to the first Adam. The Bible says that there were multiple ages during that time, but they were never given names. Scholars have given them names, as we've already noticed, but since those weren't inspired, they can't be considered to be the ages God had in mind when he inspired the idea of multiple ages, such as 1 Corinthians 2:7. Speaking of the last and second Adam, Jesus, Hebrews 9 verse 26, says that at the end of the ages, he had appeared to put away sin. So all we know for sure is that there were 2 or more ages by the time of the coming of the Messiah. However, even though there were multiple ages before Jesus, in his time, as discussed earlier, he and his people, the Jews, concerned themselves with 2 main ages, the Messianic age of glory and the pre-Messianic age of waiting and more waiting. And you can see that in Matthew 12:32 and Luke 20:34 and 35. Continuing now to keep the biblical contextual relationship creation narrative of time in mind, the question is this. Put this in italics in your brain if you're not looking at the PDF. Here's the question. Were the last days The end times of the Messianic age or the end times of the pre-Messianic age? Well, right off the bat, one would logically surmise that what those folks were looking forward to was the consummation of the pre-Messianic age, which would of course result in the Messianic age. And that makes sense when one considers that we're talking about a telos, a grand goal to be met, instead of a mere akron, a word with no goal in mind, just the end of one's finger. And so if you're thinking about time more generically than the Bible's talking about, then you're thinking more of an akron end of the world. There's no specific purpose to it. But if you're looking at it from a biblical narrative perspective in relation to redemption or salvation or the relationship of man with God being a consummated thing, something concrete, then it makes sense. There's a goal that has been met. See, the end goal, the pre-Messianic age, was the whole point to those who lived before the Messianic age, meaning that was the age they so desired to see come to fruition. Can't you just feel the eager anticipation of those who accepted Jesus as that promised Messiah who taught them about eternal life in the age to come? Luke 18:30, when they asked him, "Tell us, when will these things happen? That is, what will be the sign of your presence and the end of the age?" Matthew 24:3. I can feel the anticipation myself. If I put myself in their shoes and what they were looking forward to so much so, after all these generations, I can feel it. So when would that age reach its goal? When the Messiah was born? When he died? When he sent the Spirit? When Judaism met its demise? Some future time to us? Well, pretty much everyone in Christendom would agree that the pre-Messianic age was the age of the Old Covenant. The schoolmaster, which was bringing the Old Covenant remnant babes up to the point of being viable, mature heirs in and by virtue of the promised Messiah. When writing of this very thing between Galatians 3:18 and Galatians 4:7, Paul spoke of how that the law was their tutor and guard, bringing them to Christ so that at the appointed time they might be heirs with him and thereby be justified or made righteous, and thus of course receive the eternal life of the age to come that he had told them about. Go back and read Galatians 3:18 all the way through chapter 4 verse 7 at least, if not before and after that as well, but mainly that section to see what I'm talking about here. The Old Covenant was that pre-Messianic age time that was bringing them to this time of maturity and fulfillment in Christ. So one of the purposes of the Old Covenant economy was to bring the entirety of the remnant that was being sought and called out at that time, Romans 11 verse 5, to the point of when in Christ they had received their heirship, chapter 4 verse 6 of Galatians, resulting in redemption, chapter 4 verse 5, justification, chapter 3, verse 24, righteousness, chapter 3, verse 21, and yes, everlasting life, chapter 3, 21, and chapter 6, verse 8. All of that. That's what the Old Covenant was bringing them up to the point of receiving. Redemption, justification, righteousness even, and everlasting life. However, some may say, but as Christians, they already had all that, didn't they? Evidently not. For Paul went right on to write to these same brethren of their hope for righteousness in chapter 5, verse 5. In other words, they hadn't received it yet. Now, I discussed that at length in another lesson on my website about this whole inheritance concept. If you look for a PDF and an audio called Inheritance Bequeathed, Law Deceased, you'll find a lot of information on this very concept of righteousness still being in the future of those first generation Christians. That's what Paul said here in Galatians 5:5. Those Christians, they still were in the time of hoping for righteousness. They had not received it. Even to the Christians in Rome, Paul said that Christ's righteousness was about to be imputed to them. Romans 4:24. It had not happened yet, because Jesus had to finish his high priestly work in the most holy place of the true heaven before he could come out of that most holy place with salvation fulfilled. Hebrews 9 verse 28. So, where does this all leave us in relation to the placement of the biblical last days? Well, since the age of the Old Covenant was that which would exist until it had fulfilled its part in bringing the faithful remnant to the point of the reception of its inheritance, that is, righteousness, then when people like Peter refer to the last days, they were referring to the days when Old Covenant jots and tittles had all finally been fulfilled. A complete fulfillment of which Jesus in Luke 21:22 placed at the time of the events of the demise of Judaism in AD 70. Consider these passages for a few examples. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. It shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my Spirit. Acts 2 verse 17. In what days were the events of the day of Pentecost of Acts chapter 2? Right, AD 30. Again, Old Covenant was to bring them up to the point of righteousness, redemption, and all of that, remission of sin, etc. And that would not happen until the future time, sometime in the future, that we've already looked at, of the Galatians and the Romans. So here's Peter, 20, 30 years before that, saying we are in the last days, that His Spirit was being poured out. All right, think about it again. Listen up, you rich. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. James 5, 1 and 3. In what days had they heaped up these destructive treasures? In the last days. About when did James write his letter? Probably around AD 62. Some say AD 48. It could be anywhere in there, but let's just say AD 62. Here's the point. AD 30, Acts 2. AD 62, James chapter 5, is still before AD 70, when Jerusalem would be destroyed, when all prophecy would be fulfilled, Luke 21:22, when righteousness would be imputed, Romans 4:24. All right, let's move on. God has in these last days spoken to us by His Son, Hebrews 1 verse 2. And what days had He spoken to them? These last days. These last days? About when did Paul write Hebrews? 1999? 2017? No. These last days, Paul wrote that in AD 63. The last days of around AD 63. The last days just before AD 70, when all things were fulfilled. Again, Christ was manifested in these last times for you. 1 Peter 1 verse 20. In what times had Christ been manifested for them? In these last times. When was Christ manifested? These last times. But yet Jesus was manifested and already died 30, 40 years before Peter wrote this. Think about that. He's placing these last times as including Jesus, who had already been dead for 35 years, 37 years. That's very difficult to deal with if you look at the traditional last days or last times. So Peter includes himself in AD 67 with Jesus in AD 30 and before. The last times were therefore the last generation of Israel's existence, when the Old Covenant would be fulfilled at the end of their existence. One more. It is the last hour. Many antichrists have come by which we know it's the last hour, 1 John 2:18. Wow, now that's powerful right there. When was this last hour? John wrote this probably around AD 62. How in the world could that still apply to us today? Now, think about it. We have dates from AD 30 to AD 63, which is almost, what? About a generation, which Jesus mentioned in Luke 21:22. I've already talked about it. I'll talk about it again, too, before we get to the end of this. When Jesus was speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem, He said, At that time, everything written would be fulfilled, which a little bit after that, he used the word generation. That these things would occur within this generation in verse 32. The point is this. Biblical last days, eschatological last days, soteriological salvation last days, the last days of completing God's plan for the creation of a way for Him to have a peaceful relationship with man transpired during the last generation of Old Covenant Israel's existence. That is, the Old Covenant could not expire before national Israel expired, and national Israel could not expire before the Old Covenant expired. It was simultaneous for the remnant that was being called out, and as a bride going through her purification and preparation for her wedding, continued until all things that were written were fulfilled. So, we've discussed why the actual last days spoken of in the Bible were in direct connection with the last generation of national Israel. All Old Covenant prophecy had to be, for every jot and tittle had to be fulfilled, because that would fulfill God's redemptive plan. It would be fulfilled at the same time national Israel was destroyed and new spiritual Israel came into her full existence. But let's even more briefly, just for a couple paragraphs here and we'll be finished, consider some reasons why those days could not be otherwise. There are two times when the Bible speaks of the end, as in consummation, of the ages devoted to God's salvation plan. Paul told the Hebrew Christians that Jesus had died for them at the end of the ages, Hebrews 9:26, and he told the Christians at Corinth that they were living in the ends of the ages, 1 Corinthians 10:11. So since all biblical ages related to God's redemptive salvific plan met their goals in the last generation before the demise of national Israel in AD 70, then to claim that we're either living in the last days or that the last days are in our future implies that the old covenant is still in power. That Jesus didn't fulfill it, as he said he would in Matthew 5:17 and 18, and that we still don't have salvation or the ability to be in a relationship with our Creator even yet today. That's hard to swallow. Further, the Bible never refers anywhere to the end of time, but it does refer to the time of the end. Why? Because it doesn't concern itself with time in its generic secular sense. It's only concerned with time as it relates to the ages involved in the redemptive salvific narrative. This time of the end phrase is found 5 times in the book of Daniel. The first time is in chapter 8 verse 17 in relation to a vision that depicts a snippet of things related to the end times of Israel. The remaining 4 times are in chapters 11, 35, and 40, and chapter 12 verses 4 and 9, all of which follow on the heels of an angel saying to Daniel, "I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people Israel in the last days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come." That's in chapter 10. And after the angel led him through quite a bit of detail in chapter 11, what did Daniel discover in chapter 12 about what would occur in the last days of the time of the end? Those 2 phrases found right there in the context, chapters 10, 11, and 12. What did he discover? Well, in verse 7, the angel spoke of when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered. And then in verse 11, he spoke about the time when the daily sacrifices would be taken away and the abomination of desolation would be set up. That which Jesus himself referred to in Matthew 24 about the destruction of Jerusalem with its temple, priesthood, sacrifices, genealogical records, and so on at AD 70. Well, since I just brought up Jerusalem's demise, and since I've spent some time dealing with how that the last days were the time in which redemption became an accomplished fact, then let me close with a passage I have mentioned in passing a couple of times that seems to tie all this together. Again, Luke 21:22. In the midst of his Olivet discourse, in which he spoke about the demise of the temple and so on, that is, the things that would transpire in the last days according to Daniel 12, Jesus said that these are the days. What days? The days when all things that are written will be fulfilled. After which he went on to say in verse 28, when these things begin to happen, lift up your heads. Why? Because he said, your redemption has drawn near. And he says the same thing about the kingdom, incidentally, in verse 31. Well, that's pretty much it. Just keep in mind all of this stuff in relation to one more verse, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7, where Peter said in the mid-80s, 60s, the end of all things is at hand. Then in verse 17, he said that the time had come for the judgment to begin. See, that's the fulfillment of all things. That's the last days. The last days were the last days of the finishing, the fulfilling of God's redemptive plan. And that plan found its consummation when the Lord returned against Jerusalem and for the saints in AD 70. So there are no more last days, especially not biblically speaking. Thank you so much for being with me for such a lengthy amount of time. I look forward to any questions or comments you might have in the YouTube section or through email, through my website, or whatever. This is Tony Denton signing off on November 17th, 2017.